The morning sun hadn't fully risen over the Gulf of Aden yet, but the sea was already restless, choppy waves slapping against the steel hull of the USS Harlan County, a U.S. Navy destroyer cutting through the gray-blue water like a blade. On deck, a few sailors moved quietly, checking lines, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. Everything felt routine, calm even. But calm in these waters was always a borrowed thing, something you knew could vanish in seconds. The ship was part of a larger mission: protect cargo ships, deter pirates, and keep sea lanes open. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. The crew had been out here for weeks, rotating shifts, eating the same meals, telling the same jokes. They'd seen small skiffs darting near merchant vessels, heard radio chatter about suspicious activity along the Somali coast, but nothing that screamed imminent threat. Intelligence updates came in daily, some vague, some more urgent, but none pointed to a direct attack on a warship. After all, who would be foolish enough to take on a fully armed U.S. destroyer? The captain stood on the bridge sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. She'd been at sea most of her adult life. She knew the rhythms of the ocean, the moods of her crew, and the quiet tension that lived in this part of the world. She'd seen how local militias had grown bolder in recent months. Better weapons, faster boats, more coordination. Still, she trusted her people, trusted their training, trusted the ship beneath her feet. The Harlan County wasn't just metal and wires. It was a living thing, humming with systems designed to see, hear, and strike back before danger even got close. Down in the mess hall, a young sailor, barely 20, laughed at something his bunkmate said while buttering toast. He'd joined the Navy to see the world, to do something bigger than his hometown ever offered. He never imagined he'd end up patrolling waters where a wrong turn could mean a bullet or a bomb. But he wasn't scared. Not really. There was comfort in the routine, in the chain of command, in knowing that everyone around him had his back. Out on the radar screen, blips came and went. Fishing boats, cargo ships, the occasional Coast Guard patrol. Nothing unusual. The watch officer yawned, stretched, and double-checked the sonar feed. All quiet. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning haze. Seabirds circled lazily overhead. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful. But peace here was an illusion. Miles away, hidden in a cluster of weather-beaten huts along a remote stretch of coastline, a group of armed men huddled over a radio. They'd been watching the Harlan County for days, tracking its speed, its patrol pattern, its blind spots. They weren't pirates looking for ransom. They were something else. Fighters funded by shadowy networks trained not just to steal but to send a message. And their message was simple. Even the mighty can bleed. They believed the Americans were arrogant, soft, that their ships were symbols, not weapons that if you hit them hard enough, they'd retreat embarrassed and broken. They'd seen footage of past attacks, how slow the response could be, how confused the crew sometimes looked in the first chaotic minutes. They figured this time would be no different. One well-placed strike and the world would see that the U.S. Navy wasn't untouchable after all. Their plan was brutal in its simplicity. Use fishing boats as cover. Approach fast. Overwhelm with noise, fire, and fear. Ram the ship with an explosive-laden skiff, while others fired rockets and automatic weapons from close range. They didn't expect to sink the destroyer, not really. But they expected it to burn, to lose power, to go dark. And in that moment of vulnerability, they'd claim victory. Broadcast it. Let it echo across every news channel and online forum they could reach. Back on the Harlan County, no alarm sounded. No red lights flashed. The crew went about their duties, checking engine temps, updating logs, swapping stories about home. A petty officer double-checked the fire suppression systems just because it was Tuesday. Another sailor tuned his guitar during a rare quiet moment. Life on a warship wasn't all drills and danger. It was also long stretches of waiting, of finding small joys in the middle of nowhere. But then, without warning, the horizon changed. 3 small boats appeared out of the morning mist, too fast, too close, moving in formation. At first, the bridge crew thought they were just local fishermen cutting corners. But fishermen didn't travel in tight triangles. Fishermen didn't carry heavy machine guns mounted on their decks. And fishermen certainly didn't accelerate to 40 knots straight toward a U.S. warship. The watch officer's voice sharpened. Bridge, this is lookout. 3 contacts bearing 2-on-10, closing fast, armed. Repeat, armed. The captain set her coffee down. No panic, no shouting. Just a calm, firm command. Sound general quarters. All hands battle stations, the ship came alive instantly. Klaxons blared. Hatches slammed shut. Sailors dropped what they were doing and ran. Not in fear, but with purpose. Years of drills kicked in. Every person knew exactly where to go, what to do. The young sailor from the mess hall sprinted to his damage control station, heart pounding but hands steady. The petty officer who'd checked the fire systems moments ago was now strapping on his helmet, ready to seal off compartments if needed. On the bridge, the captain watched the radar as the skiffs closed the distance, less than a kilometer now, then 800 meters, 600. The ship's defensive systems whirred to life, radars locking on, guns swiveling toward the threat. But rules of engagement were strict. They couldn't fire first unless fired upon, so they waited, braced, ready. And then, it happened. A streak of fire lit up the sky. A rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the superstructure with a deafening crack. Glass shattered. Metal screamed. Seconds later, gunfire erupted. Wild, furious bursts tearing into the ship's side. Alarms howled. Smoke curled from a fresh wound near the antenna array, but the worst was yet to come. One of the skiffs broke away from the others, turning sharply toward the Harlan County's port side. It wasn't trying to escape. It was charging, full speed. The men on board were shouting, waving, their faces twisted with something between rage and triumph. They thought this was the end, the moment the mighty ship would falter. They were wrong. The Harlan County didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't beg for mercy. As the suicide skiff closed in, the ship's automated guns opened fire, not in panic but with chilling precision. Tracers lit up the water. The skiff exploded in a fireball just meters from the hull, showering the deck in burning debris. But the blast still hit. Hard. The impact rocked the ship. Flames licked up the side. Power flickered. For a few terrifying seconds, chaos threatened to take hold. But then, voices, orders, movement, the crew didn't freeze. They fought back. They sealed off flooded sections. They dragged wounded shipmates to safety. They kept the engines running. On the bridge, the captain's uniform was torn, a cut on her forehead bleeding into her eye. She wiped it away without flinching. "Damage report," she said, voice steady. "And get me comms back online, now." The attackers, watching from their remaining skiffs, expected smoke, silence, surrender. Instead, they saw a ship that refused to die, a crew that refused to break. And in that moment, their confidence cracked. They'd come for submission. What they got was something else entirely. The smoke wouldn't stop. It curled up from the port side of the ship like a ghost trying to escape, thick and black, stinging eyes and choking lungs. The blast from the suicide skiff had torn a jagged hole just above the waterline, and now seawater was hissing as it met hot metal. But the worst wasn't the fire or the flooding. It was the silence that followed the initial chaos. For a few heartbeats, no one spoke. Everyone just listened, waiting to see if the ship would groan and give in. Or fight back. It fought back. From deep inside the hull, voices started rising, calm, sharp, urgent. "Seal bulkhead 3! Fire team, forward compartment! Medical, we've got 2 down near the galley." There was no panic, only purpose. Sailors who'd been eating breakfast minutes ago were now dragging hoses, patching leaks, and checking on each other with a kind of quiet urgency that only comes from knowing your life, and the lives of everyone around you, depends on what you do next. On the bridge, the captain wiped blood from her eyebrow with the back of her glove. Her radio crackled, half dead but still working. She barked orders, not loud but firm enough that every word cut through the noise. "Get the CIWS online, now, and someone tell me if those skiffs are still out there." They were. 2 of the attack boats had pulled back, circling like sharks, waiting to see if the ship would go dark. They thought the first strike had done the job. They expected the destroyer to drift, helpless, maybe even start listing. But the Harlan County wasn't listing. It was turning slowly, deliberately, bringing its starboard side to bear. And that side held weapons they hadn't seen yet. Below deck, a young technician with grease on his cheek and sweat in his eyes worked frantically to reroute power. Half the systems were down, but he knew the backup circuits like the back of his hand. He'd spent nights studying schematics no one else cared about, just in case. Now just in case had arrived. His fingers flew over switches, bypassing fried relays, coaxing life back into the ship's nervous system. When the radar screen flickered back on, he let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Outside, the sea was eerily quiet again, except for the crackle of flames and the low hum of the ship's engines still running. Then, a new sound, the high-pitched whine of the phalanx gun system powering up. It sounded almost alive, like a predator waking up. The attackers heard it too. One of the skiffs gunned its engine, trying to flee. But it was too late. The CIWS, a radar-guided Gatling gun designed to shred incoming missiles, swiveled with mechanical precision. It didn't fire wildly. It didn't waste ammo. It tracked the lead skiff, calculated its speed, and unleashed a short, brutal burst. 20mm shells tore through fiberglass and flesh in less than 3 seconds. The boat disintegrated. Wood, metal, and debris sprayed across the water. The second skiff tried to zigzag, but the system locked on again. Another burst. Another explosion. Then silence. Real silence this time. No cheers came from the crew. No whooping or fist-pumping. They were too busy. Too focused. Because even though the immediate threat was gone, the ship was still wounded. Water was rising in 2 compartments. Smoke was spreading through the lower decks. And somewhere, 2 of their own were hurt. A damage control team in fire-resistant suits moved like shadows through the haze, checking bulkheads, testing for heat, listening for leaks. One of them found a trapped cook in the mess area, dazed but alive, pinned under a fallen locker. They lifted it together, no words needed, just shared strength. Another sailor used his own shirt to stop a bleeding gash on a shipmate's arm until the medics arrived. These weren't heroes in a movie. They were just people doing what had to be done because the person next to them mattered more than fear. Up on the bridge, the captain finally got a working satellite link. Her voice was hoarse but clear. "This is Harlan County. We've been attacked. 2 skiffs neutralized, ship damaged but stable. Request immediate support and medical evac for 2 injured personnel." She gave coordinates, damage estimates, threat assessment, all in under a minute. Then she turned to her officer of the deck. "Keep us moving. Slow speed, but keep us moving. I don't want to be a sitting duck." The ship limped forward at 5 knots, listing slightly to port, smoke still trailing behind it like a dark banner. But it was sailing, not sinking, not surrendering. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the message hit command centers like a lightning strike. Alerts flashed. Generals stood up from their desks. Fighter jets were scrambled before the full report even finished downloading. This wasn't just an attack, it was a declaration. And the U.S. Navy doesn't ignore declarations. Back on the Harlan County, the crew worked through the afternoon. They patched the hull with emergency plates. They pumped out water. They rerouted power again and again as systems failed and rebooted. Someone found a working coffee maker in the auxiliary galley and started brewing. Because sometimes, in the middle of hell, hot coffee is the closest thing to hope. The 2 injured sailors were stabilized and moved to the medical bay. One had a broken leg, the other a concussion, but both were awake, talking, even cracking weak jokes. That lifted spirits more than any speech could. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and purples, the captain walked the main deck. She didn't say much, just nodded at her crew, touched a shoulder here and there, checked on the repair teams. She saw exhaustion in their eyes, but also something else. Resolve. Pride. The quiet kind that doesn't need words. The attackers had thought this ship would break. That its crew would panic. That its systems would fail. That its spirit would shatter under fire. But they didn't understand what holds a warship together. It's not just steel or electronics. It's trust. Training. The unspoken promise that no one gets left behind. And now, as the Harlan County sailed on, wounded but unbroken, the real message was being sent. Not with words, not with broadcasts, but with every nod of forward motion, every light still glowing on the bridge, every hand still working to keep the ship alive. The ambush had failed. Worse than that, for those who launched it, it had backfired. Because now, the full weight of a global naval force was turning its eyes toward that stretch of coastline, not in anger, not in rage, but with cold, methodical focus. The kind that doesn't just respond, it erases. But that would come later. For now, on this battered ship in the fading light, there was only one mission: stay afloat, stay together, and keep going. And they were doing exactly that. Night fell over the Gulf of Aden like a heavy blanket, but no one on the Harlan County was sleeping. The ship moved slowly through the dark water, still listing slightly, still smoking in places, but alive, stubbornly, defiantly alive. Every light that worked was on, casting long shadows across the deck where sailors moved in quiet pairs, checking welds, testing hoses, listening for the groan of stressed metal. The air smelled of salt, burnt wiring, and the sharp tang of seawater mixed with diesel. It wasn't pretty, but it was steady, and steady was enough. Down below in the heart of the ship, engineers worked in shifts, their faces streaked with oil and sweat. They'd jury-rigged a temporary power line to keep the pumps running in the damaged compartments. One of them, a wiry guy with a faded tattoo on his forearm, had been awake for nearly 24 hours straight. But he kept humming an old rock song under his breath, something to keep his mind off the ache in his back and the worry in his gut. He wasn't thinking about glory or headlines. He was thinking about whether the next bulkhead would hold, whether the bilge pumps would keep up, whether his buddy in the next room was going to be okay. That was the real war down here. Not against enemies, but against time, fatigue, and the sea itself. Up on the bridge, the captain stood with her arms crossed, watching the radar sweep the empty horizon. The immediate threat was gone, but she knew better than to relax. In these waters, silence could mean anything. Peace or the calm before another storm. She'd ordered extra lookouts posted, thermal scopes scanning the blackness, sonar pinging every few minutes. She didn't trust the night. Not after what had happened. But what surprised her most wasn't the damage, it was the mood. She expected tension, maybe fear, maybe even anger. Instead, there was a strange kind of calm. Not the calm of surrender, but the calm of people who'd stared down disaster and found they were still standing. They'd lost equipment, sure. They'd lost comfort. But they hadn't lost each other. And that made all the difference. A junior officer handed her a fresh cup of coffee. Real coffee this time, not the burnt sludge from earlier. She nodded thanks and took a sip. It was bitter but hot. Good enough. Comms are stable now, Captain, the officer said quietly. We've got secure link to Fleet Command. They're sending a support ship, should be here by dawn. She nodded again. Good, tell them we don't need rescue. We need supplies, and medical for the 2 injured. No, ma'am, the officer said with a small, tired smile. They already know. That was the thing about being part of something bigger, you didn't have to explain everything. People had your back even when you couldn't see them. Meanwhile, in the mess hall, what was left of it, a group of off-duty sailors sat on overturned crates, sharing MREs and stories. One of them mimicked the sound of the CIWS firing, making everyone laugh. Another pulled out a deck of cards, and soon they were playing a quiet game of poker by flashlight. It wasn't normal, but it was normal for them now. They weren't pretending the attack didn't happen. They were just choosing not to let it own them. One sailor, younger than the rest, stared out a cracked porthole at the stars. He'd joined the Navy thinking he'd see exotic ports and sunny beaches. Instead, he'd spent months at sea, eating the same food, wearing the same clothes, watching the same endless water. And now this. But strangely, he didn't regret it. Because in the last few hours, he'd seen what his crew was really made of. Not just skill, but heart. The kind that shows up when everything else falls apart. Back on the bridge, the captain received a new message. Short, encrypted, just 3 words. Hold the line. She read it twice, then tucked the printout into her pocket. That was all she needed. No grand speeches, no dramatic orders. Just 3 words that said everything. We see you. We're coming. Don't give an inch. And they wouldn't. Even as the ship limped forward, systems flickering, hull groaning, the crew kept working. A team welded a patch over the blast hole, sparks flying into the night like tiny fireworks. Another group tested the backup navigation system, making sure they could still steer if the main one failed again. Someone even found time to sweep broken glass off the deck because order mattered even in chaos. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting silver light on the water. The wind picked up, but the ship held course. No alarms, no new contacts. Just the steady thrum of the engines and the occasional shout from a repair team. Then, just before 0300, something changed. A faint blip appeared on the long-range radar, far out, but closing. The watch officer tensed. Captain, possible surface contact. Bearing 185, speed 30 knots, she stepped closer to the screen. 1 boat or more? Looks like. One small, fast silence fell over the bridge. Everyone knew what that could mean. Another attack, a scout? or just a lost fisherman. But the captain didn't hesitate. Bring weapons to ready. Not armed, just ready. And hail them on all channels. The radio crackled to life. Standard warning in English, then Arabic, then Somali. No response. The blip kept coming, tension thickened. Hands hovered near switches. Eyes stayed locked on the screen. The young sailor at the CIWS console flexed his fingers, remembering the feel of the trigger from earlier. But then, just as the contact hit, 2,000 meters, the blip slowed, stopped, then turned away, a collective breath released probably. Just testing us, the captain said. Or watching. Do we chase? Someone asked. She shook her head. No, we stay on mission. Protect the ship. That's how we win. Because she understood something the attackers never did. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about chasing ghosts across the sea. It was about standing firm, about showing that you could be hit and keep going, that you could bleed and still stand tall. By first light, the support ship appeared on the horizon, a supply vessel with medical staff and spare parts. As it drew closer, the crew of the Harlan County didn't cheer. They just stood a little straighter. Because help had come, yes, but they'd held on long enough to meet it, and that was victory enough. The attackers had expected submission. They thought a single strike would break the ship's spirit, send it crawling back to port in shame. But instead, they'd awakened something far more dangerous. The quiet, unshakable will of people who refused to be erased. Now, as the sun rose over the water, painting the sky in soft golds and pinks, the Harlan County sailed on, not fast, not perfect, but whole. Not because it was invincible, but because its crew chose again and again to keep fighting for each other. And that choice? That was the real weapon, the one no ambush could ever destroy. While the Harlan County drifted slowly through the morning light, patched and weary but still upright, something very different was unfolding far away, on land, in the sky, and deep inside command centers thousands of miles apart. The message had gone out not just as a distress call but as a line drawn in the sand. And now the response was moving like a storm gathering on the horizon. It didn't start with explosions or shouting. It started with silence, focused, methodical silence. In a secure operations room somewhere in the desert, analysts hunched over screens, cross-referencing satellite images, radio intercepts, and drone footage. They weren't looking for revenge. They were looking for truth. Who did this? Where did they come from? Where are they now? Within hours, the pieces began to fit. The attack boats hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. They'd launched from a cluster of buildings near a remote cove, once a quiet fishing village, now turned into a staging ground. Weapons had been moved in under cover of night. Boats refueled, fighters trained, all of it captured by high-altitude drones circling like hawks, invisible and patient. But knowing wasn't enough. Acting was. By midday, fighter jets roared off the deck of an aircraft carrier stationed in the Arabian Sea. Not in a blind rage, but with surgical precision. Their mission wasn't to flatten everything in sight. It was to remove the threat, cleanly, completely, and without harming nearby civilians. Every target had been verified twice, sometimes 3 times. Coordinates locked. Rules of engagement clear. This wasn't chaos. It was consequence. At the same time, a small team of special operators, men and women who trained for years for moments like this, boarded helicopters in Djibouti. They carried light gear, night vision scopes, and a simple objective: secure the compound, gather intelligence, and if possible, take key figures alive. They knew the risks, knew the terrain, knew that every second on the ground was borrowed time. But they also knew what the Harlan County had endured, and that mattered more than fear. Back on the ship, no one knew the details yet. But they could feel it. The shift in the air, the extra radio traffic, the way command messages now carried a different tone. Not relief, not celebration, but certainty. Something was happening. And it was happening because of them. A sailor on watch spotted a distant flash on the southern horizon, too bright for lightning, too quick for a ship. He didn't say anything, just watched it fade, then went back to scanning the water. He didn't need to know the full picture. He just needed to trust that someone, somewhere, was making sure this wouldn't happen again. That night, under a moonless sky, the strike began. First came the drones, silent, unseen, dropping small, precise munitions on weapon caches, fuel depots, and communication hubs. No massive bombs, No firestorms. Just enough force to disable, not destroy. Then came the jets, low and fast, hitting command posts and boat storage areas with laser-guided accuracy. Within minutes, the compound that had launched the attack was dark, quiet, and broken. But the real work started after the explosion stopped. The special operators touched down in black helicopters, moving like shadows through the rubble. They cleared buildings room by room, not with brute force, but with discipline and control. They found documents, hard drives, maps, evidence that would help unravel larger networks. And yes, they found people, some armed, some not. Those who surrendered were treated humanely as the rules demanded. Those who fought didn't last long. This wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. One young operator, barely older than some of the sailors on the Harlan County, knelt beside a captured radio logbook, carefully bagging it. He thought about the ship out there on the water, how it had taken a direct hit and still refused to go down. He thought about the 2 injured crew members, the burned decks, the hours of repair work. And he made a silent promise. We've got your back. By dawn, it was over. The compound was secure. Intelligence was flowing back to command centers. And the message, unspoken but clear, was spreading through every channel those attackers used to boast and plan. Don't test us again. There were no victory parades. No dramatic speeches. Just reports filed, gear cleaned, and debriefings held in quiet rooms. Because in this world, success isn't measured in noise, it's measured in silence. The silence of a sea with no ambushes. The silence of a coastline with no hidden weapons. The silence of a ship that can sail without looking over its shoulder. Back on the Harlan County, the crew finally got the full update. Not in graphic detail, just enough to know the threat had been dealt with. No one cheered. No one gloated. There was just a quiet nod exchanged between sailors. A shared understanding that justice wasn't about anger. It was about making sure the next ship, the next crew, wouldn't have to go through what they did. One older chief petty officer stood on the repaired section of the deck, running a hand over the fresh welds. He'd been in the Navy for 25 years. Seen close calls, seen losses, seen moments when the line between luck and disaster was paper thin. But this felt different. Not because they'd been attacked, but because they'd held. And because the system behind them, the people, the training, the response, had worked exactly as it should. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the ocean in warm reds and oranges, the captain gathered her senior staff on the bridge. No formal meeting. Just a few minutes of quiet talk. We didn't just survive, she said, voice low but firm. We showed them what this ship and every ship like it stands for. Not just firepower, not just steel, but the will to keep going no matter what. And that will had triggered something bigger. Not just a military response, but a shift in how threats were handled from now on. New protocols were already being drafted. Faster drone coverage over patrol zones, tighter coordination with allied navies, better early warning systems for small boat swarms. The Harlan County's ordeal wasn't going to be forgotten. It was going to make every ship safer. Later that night, a sailor sat alone on the fantail staring at the stars. He thought about home, about his family, his dog, the little diner where he used to get pancakes on Sundays. He missed all of it. But he also knew why he was here. Not for glory, not for politics, but because someone had to stand watch. Someone had to say, "You don't get to decide when we break." And they hadn't broken. The attackers had thought a single strike would be enough to make a point. But they'd missed the real story. The real story wasn't about one ship or one attack. It was about what happens when you push people who've trained, trusted, and bled together, and they push back. Not with rage. Not with chaos, but with precision. With unity. With a kind of quiet, relentless force that doesn't just answer a threat, it erases it. And out there in the vast, dark ocean, the Harlan County sailed on. No longer just a target, but a symbol. Not of war, but of resolve. The kind that doesn't shout. It just endures. And in the end, that's what changes everything. The Harlan County didn't return to port with fanfare. No crowds lined the docks. No cameras flashed. Just a quiet arrival at a naval base under gray morning skies. The ship moving slowly, still bearing the scars of what it had been through. Charred metal, patched hull plates, and the faint smell of smoke that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. But to those who knew what it had faced, the ship didn't look broken. It looked proud. The crew stepped onto solid ground for the first time in weeks, blinking in the sunlight like people waking from a long, hard dream. Some stretched, some hugged the earth beneath their boots, others just stood still for a moment, breathing air that didn't taste like salt and diesel. They were tired, deep in their bones, but there was a quiet strength in the way they carried themselves. They hadn't just survived. They'd held the line. Inside the base hospital, the two injured sailors were already on the mend. One walked with a cane, joking with nurses about how he'd earned his sea legs the hard way. The other, still in a neck brace, gave a thumbs up to his shipmates who came to visit. No one talked much about the attack. They didn't need to. They'd all been there. They all knew the sound of the explosion, the smell of burning wires, the weight of that first terrifying silence. What mattered now wasn't the fear. It was what they'd done after. Back on the ship, inspectors moved through every compartment, documenting damage, praising repairs, and taking notes that would shape future naval designs. One engineer pointed out how the crew had rerouted power using spare parts and sheer will. Another showed how a makeshift bulkhead had held back flooding long enough for the pumps to catch up. These weren't just fixes, they were lessons written in sweat and steel. Meanwhile, in a small briefing room, the captain sat with senior officers from the fleet. There were no medals on the table yet, no speeches. Just honest talk about what happened, what worked, and what needed to change. She spoke calmly, clearly, about the early warning gaps, the need for better small boat detection, the value of crew training under real stress. Her words weren't about blame. They were about making sure the next crew wouldn't have to learn the same lessons the hard way, and those lessons spread fast. Within weeks, new protocols rolled out across the fleet. Ships began running extra drills for fast boat swarm scenarios. Radar systems got software updates to better spot low-profile threats in cluttered waters. Even the way lookouts were stationed changed. More eyes, wider arcs, constant communication. None of it was flashy, but it was real. And it came straight from the experience of one ship that refused to go down. Months later, at a naval academy halfway across the country, a group of young recruits sat in a dim classroom watching a training video. It wasn't Hollywood. No dramatic music, no slow-motion heroics. Just grainy footage from the Harlan County's cameras. Smoke, shouts, the CIWS firing, sailors moving with calm urgency. The instructor paused it and said, "This isn't about how to fight. It's about how to hold together when everything tries to pull you apart." The story of the Harlan County became part of the Navy's living memory, not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. Not because it was the first ship attacked, but because it was the one that changed the game. Before, some believed that in modern warfare, big ships were too valuable to risk in dangerous waters. After, they realized that with the right training, the right mindset, and the right crew, even a wounded ship could be a fortress. The captain eventually received a high honor, not just for command, but for leadership under fire. But when asked about it later, she just shrugged. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "I just trusted my crew." And they trusted each other. That was the real secret, the thing no weapon system could replicate: trust. The kind that's built over months of shared meals, shared watches, shared jokes in the middle of nowhere. The kind that says, "I've got your back no matter what." That's what kept the lights on when the power failed. That's what kept hands steady when the world exploded around them. Years passed. The Harlan County went back to sea, repaired, upgraded, but still carrying the memory of that day in its bones. New sailors joined, heard the stories, walked the same decks. Some touched the patched hull and felt a strange kind of pride, not because of the damage, but because of what came after. And out in the world, the ripple effects continued. Shipping companies reported fewer aggressive approaches in the region. Local coast guards trained with new U.S. support became more active. Even rival groups began avoiding areas where U.S. ships patrolled. Not out of fear of firepower, but because they'd learned a hard truth. Attacking a ship like the Harlan County didn't make you look strong. It made you a target. But none of that was why the crew did what they did. They didn't fight to send a message. They fought because it was their job. Because the person next to them was counting on them. Because giving up wasn't in their nature. One evening, long after the repairs were done and the medals handed out, a sailor sat alone on the pier, watching the Harlan County bob gently in the harbor. He'd been on board that day. He remembered the heat, the noise, the moment he thought it might be over. But he also remembered the hand that pulled him up when he stumbled. The voice that said, "Keep moving." The quiet hum of the engines that never stopped. He smiled faintly. Not because it was over, but because they'd made it through together. The attackers had come expecting submission. They thought a single strike would be enough to shake a superpower, to prove that even the strongest could bleed and break. But they misunderstood something fundamental. Strength isn't just about weapons or armor. It's about people. About the quiet courage to keep going when everything says to stop. About the refusal to let fear win. And in the end, that's what turned an ambush into a lesson, and a ship into a symbol. Not of war. Not of revenge, but of resilience. Because out there on the open sea where the horizon stretches forever and danger can come from any direction, the most powerful weapon isn't a missile or a radar. It's the human heart, steady, stubborn, and unbroken. And that's something no ambush can ever destroy.